Good evening, and welcome to this, the second of my lectures about Darwin. I've called the series Darwin's Descent, and tonight's episode is called Making a Monkey Out of Darwin. Images like this is a French one, are very familiar. We often see them when Darwin's being discussed. Pictured as an ape swinging from tree to tree. In this case, the tree is actually labelled Arbre de la Science, the tree of science, the tree of knowledge. And what I want to tease out is some of the things that these images mean, what they tell us about Darwin and about his times, and I think rather unexpectedly, about some of the ways in which people found evolution consoling or reassuring, which helps us to understand its comparatively rapid acceptance in some parts of the world, at least, in its own time. But I want to start by raising the question of the monkey in the room. Why is Darwin depicted in this way? These images have become so familiar to us that they seem quite natural and quite normal, but they are the products of quite a specific set of historic circumstances and coincidences. Darwin's face, his beard, his beetle brow and so on are an absolute gift to caricaturists, but sticking them on an ape's body is a product, as I say, of a particular time and place. I have a kind of passion for these images, so there are rather lots of them in my collection. This one is rather nice, the kind of reference to Hamlet, the chimp contemplating the human skull sitting on a volume of Darwin. I've heard that Lenin had a copy of this statue on his desk. I've not been able to confirm it. Darwin has been a long-time favourite of advertisers of all kinds. One of the earliest examples here for a gargling oil with the chimp telling him proudly that he was Darwin's grandpa. What is good for man or beast is doubly good for me. And evolution continues to be used regularly by advertisers, particularly in the sense of progress. Darwin was picked up by caricaturists in his own day. Each new book would be greeted by an image like this one. The caption here, "That troubles our monkey again." This was apropos of his book on the expression of the emotions in man. And the young lady is saying, really, Mr. Darwin, say what you like about men, but leave my emotions alone. And his similarity to a monkey is played on over and over again by caricaturists. This one here referencing The Descent of Man, the anniversary of which falls in just a few months' time. And of course, he's become a stalwart of T-shirts of all kinds, pro and anti-Darwin T-shirts, creationist ones, and so on. So the association is there and it keeps being recycled. And as I say, I have quite a collection of these. We could be here all night if I started showing you every single one. I'll spare you that. But it's interesting to see the different ways Darwin is deployed and the way that the ape motif is always there, whether that people are being pro or anti-Darwin, references to apes, jokes about apes, keep getting made in different contexts. And yet, this is not as obvious as it seems, because actually Darwin doesn't say anything about apes. The idea that Darwin said we're all descended from monkeys actually isn't really very accurate. What he actually said, rather, if we bring it up to date in modern terms, is that we shared a common ancestor with the great apes millions of years ago. But in The Origin of Species, he doesn't touch on the subject at all. Apes aren't even mentioned. There's only one sentence about human evolution in The Origin of Species. Famously, all he said was, light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history, once my views have been accepted, once the idea of evolution by natural selection has been accepted. You search the book in vain, and I have to say this is a much easier job now that it's online than it was when I first started studying Darwin. The word monkey appears just 3 times in the whole book, and there's no hint of any connection to human beings in any of those 3 references. The word ape doesn't appear anywhere in the book. None of the species of great apes appears. There are no chimps, no gorillas, no orangs. So how and why does this link get made? Well, one of the contexts for thinking about Darwin, as I mentioned in the first lecture, is thinking about the context of Victorian industrialisation, and particularly the industrialisation of print. That linking of steam-powered printing and cheap machine-made paper, which makes printed matter so common, allows for the bestseller really to be invented. It allows for a new kind of person, the man of letters, to come into existence, and of course the woman of letters too. But it also allows for celebrity in the modern sense. And Darwin is really the first ever scientific celebrity. because of the circumstances, the times in which he lived, and the ways his ideas and those images of him are reproduced and printed and sold. So a gigantic printing press like this is my kind of favourite image of the Victorian period, and it's just a reminder of this vast proliferation of printed materials of every kind, magazine upon magazine, evangelical magazines, religious ones, magazines for children, magazines for experts, elite gentry, all kinds of things. Darwinism spreads through all of these different kinds of publications in the English-speaking world, in Britain and America particularly, but is translated and spreads around the world. There really is a kind of global Darwinism. And one of the consequences of that is that Darwin's face becomes a kind of trademark for something called Darwinism. Sticking him on an ape's body makes the link more explicit. But Darwinism means many different things to different people. And for some people, it embodies an idea of progress, an idea, a celebration of secularism, of doing away with old superstitions and old ideas, hurling ourselves towards modernity, into futurity, as one of Darwin's disciples, H.G. Wells, would say. But of course, it has very different meanings for different audiences. For some people, Darwin, of course, is almost the devil incarnate for his destruction, as they see it, of traditional values and traditional religious values in particular. And in some senses, these reactions to Darwin are all products of the way that he was read. And I want to stress that Darwin is not read, as it were, completely afresh. He's read in the light of various texts that have come before, of different kinds. One of which, of course, is the Judeo-Christian Bible and the expectations about humanity's place in the world of nature and so on. But many other books and images are going to shape the expectations people have when they pick up The Origin and Darwin's other books. So one of the most important contexts is this: The Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, published in 1844. This is the big evolutionary bestseller of the Victorian period. It published well before Darwin, and it carries on selling very well in cheap editions all around the world for many, many years after Darwin publishes. A great many references to ideas about evolution in Victorian literature and so on are really, when you look at them closely, references to the Vestiges. And the Vestiges set up a picture of what it called progressive development, very much a story, an onward and upward story of improvement through life's history. And that expectation that evolution means progress is one of the things readers would bring to bear when they come to read Darwin's ideas. So there is a web of texts that relate to each other that give a set of expectations. They create a kind of genre that one of my friends, the historian Bernie Lightman, has called the evolutionary epic, these kind of grand tales of progress, this grand history of life that begins way back with the formation of the Earth itself and goes on perhaps into the distant future. But as part of that web of texts which shape the way Darwin is read, I think all kinds of ideas about apes are even more important in shaping the way people are going to react. Now, lots of cultures have quite positive views of apes. There are wise monkey gods in various cultures and so on, but the Judeo-Christian tradition tends to be rather negative. These are marginalia, drawings in the margins of medieval manuscripts done by bored monks, I think. But they often express the idea that monkeys embody the lowest part of humans. So in this case, the monkeys here are getting drunk, something which is in fact a purely human vice, but is here ascribed to the apes. They represent something bestial and low in ourselves. Apes and monkeys are often depicted as lustful. I think in this picture, there's more than a hint that both these apes may be male. In some of these margins, that is made very explicit in a way that I think is not quite suitable for a Gresham lecture. But you can see, again, aspects of ourselves that are sometimes called bestial, our animal natures being brought out in these images. And this one I particularly like. It's really hard not to see this monkey as wicked, mischievous, scheming, untrustworthy, almost demonic. And there is one tradition in Christian thinking that actually argues that apes were made by Satan as a mockery of God's creation, that they are a caricature of human beings. And the similarities between us, of course, have been something authors have been aware of going right back to pre-Christian times. And one of the things monkeys are often credited with is an ability to imitate humans, but they're not that good at it. So it's rather a reassuring comparison in some ways. They're like us, but worse than us in some ways. And the way that apes are put to use in adverts and in circus shows and things like that. I grew up in an age where Brook Bond tea was still being advertised with chimps tea parties, chimps dressed up as humans on television and so on. So that imitation of humanity, but a pale, imperfect, laughable imitation is one of the things that gives us a kind of reassuring sense of our own superiority. When it comes to the great apes, though, the story brings us a little bit closer to Darwin's time, and we start to get slightly more specific associations. There are hundreds and hundreds of writers I could talk about here, but I'm just going to pick out a couple of themes. Let's think about the orangutan, for example, a particular word that becomes applied now to one species of ape, but was originally used much more broadly to mean any of the great apes. One of the places we first come across this is in Jacob de Bont, or Bontius, as he's known in the Latin form. He's a Dutch physician and naturalist working for the Dutch East India Company. And he reports various indigenous beliefs about the apes, including the fact that the apes were in fact people who could speak, but they refused to speak because if they did, people would recognize that they could be enslaved and put to work. And the apes preferred the life of ease in the forest, avoiding the necessity of work. And de Bont is also the first person to actually use the Malay words orangutan, or borrows them from Malay into Dutch and then eventually into English. And he explains in his book that orangutan quod hominem silvae significat, which means man of the woods or man of the forest. Modern linguists actually think this is probably a slight misunderstanding or mistranslation. It doesn't actually seem to have been a particular name for the species that we now call orangs, but it became attached to them in this process of translation and export to wider speaking worlds. When we look at de Bont's picture of an orangutan, we have the strong suspicion that he may never have actually seen one. And there is definitely a confusion in these stories between various myths and legends of savage or primitive human beings and the apes. And so the question of where the boundary lies, this signifies man of the forest. Are they people? Are they degenerate people, people who've reverted back to an earlier animal state? Or are they a simpler, purer kind of people, something which the philosopher Rousseau is going to speculate about in later times? As I say, the term orangutan is used quite promiscuously, interchangeably with other words like pongo and so on. And it's unclear in many cases in these ancient texts or early modern texts what kind of ape is actually being discussed. One of the first kind of rigorous scientific descriptions of an ape is the responsibility of this man, Edward Tyson, who is an early member of the Royal Society, which came into existence at Gresham or as a result of conversations among the gentlemen at Gresham. So he has a kind of link to the college itself, which is rather nice. And he wrote the first accurate description of a great ape, which he called orangutan, or the anatomy of a pygmy compared with that of a monkey, an ape, and a man, right at the end of the 17th century. And this is his picture. Now, to modern eyes, I think this is immediately and very obviously a picture of a juvenile chimp. But as I say, he uses these words orangutan, and other writers at the time use them interchangeably with one species for another. And it's interesting that he assumes that this creature, this pygmy as he calls it, is a human being, because as you may well know, the chimps are actually much more human-like when they're juveniles than as they age. A mature chimp begins to develop a pronounced muzzle, big canine teeth, features that are much different to human ones. A juvenile like this one has a flatter face, rounder eyes, no protruding jaw, no big canine teeth, looks much more human. And I'm not sure that Tyson immediately realized how young the ape that he was dissecting was. This one, the poor thing, was brought to Britain as a curiosity alive, died soon afterwards, which is how Tyson got to dissect it. Now, my interest in this topic, the whole topic of Darwinism and evolution and so on, really began with this man, Stephen Jay Gould, Harvard historian of science and a geologist, evolutionary biologist as well, an extraordinary polymath. And one of the many things he did was he wrote these popular essays for the magazine Natural History, which collected into a series of books. And this one has an essay about Tyson and his pygmy, which is where I first came across him. And Gould argues that Tyson's description of his pygmy is deeply shaped by a very ancient tradition in thought known as the Great Chain of Being. This goes right back to classical authors long before the Christian era, but then gets reinterpreted in Christian times and reinvented and refined over many, many successive authors over many years. But the idea, very briefly, is that everything is connected into a continuous series from the least perfect to the most perfect. So you have sort of minerals, rocks, mud at the bottom of the chain, and then you go up gradually through the tiniest, simplest organisms, up through plants to animals, to increasingly sophisticated animals, to humans, to angels, and then to God, right at the top of the chain, the most perfect thing that can be imagined. And this idea is very much a static idea. It embodies the idea that creation had a place for everything, and everything was in its place. Nothing could move up or down the chain, and that's quite an important point about it. I did my first degree after reading Gould and getting excited about this, at the University of New South Wales in Australia, and not long before I'd arrived there, they'd created a new School of Humanities, and one of my teachers told me that they decided that each department in the new school would put on a party for the other people to introduce them to their discipline and what they did, and start to bond them together into a school, which was kind of a nice idea. So the School of Spanish and Latin American Studies put on an evening of flamenco dancing and served tapas, which was lovely. Next up was History and Philosophy of Science. My department, who were struggling to think what on earth they were going to do, there are in fact no traditional history of science folk dances, for example. And they hit on the idea of doing a great chain of being party. So when you came in, there was a long table, and at one end was salt, which represented minerals, and then it went up through different kinds of fruits and vegetables and animals and so on, and ended with a bottle of vodka, which represented pure spirit at the other end. So it's a nice, easy way to remember the great chain of being. Anyway, Gould uses this, argues very clearly that Tyson made use of this idea in interpreting what he was seeing when he dissected the chimp. Our pygmy is no man, nor yet a common ape, but a sort of animal between both. Now, some people have read that, I think rather anachronistically, as saying that Tyson was a kind of proto-evolutionist, that he recognized these links in this, that the chain was perhaps a developmental chain, a chain of ancestry. But as I said, that's really not how the chain works. And it's actually quite clear when you read Tyson carefully, and Gould brings this out very clearly, that that's not what he's implying. Our pygmy has many advantages above the rest of its species, yet I still think it but a sort of ape and a mere brute. And issues around language are one of the things that are used to distinguish this. So this debate about whether apes could speak or not is one of the many things that becomes a focus of how closely linked to us are they. And Tyson goes on, as the proverb has it, an ape is an ape, though finely clad. It reminds me of the chimp's tea party again. The other question about the apes is not just how like us they are, how similar they are to us, whether they represent a necessary intermediate step. I think the idea that the chain is God's design for the universe means it must be perfect. So if there are gaps in it, then they need to be filled. And in fact, the notion of a missing link is an idea that is much, much older than evolution, and it represents the idea of a gap in the chain. So making the chimp into a gap between the animal and the human kingdoms fills out the perfection of divine design. It doesn't imply an evolutionary lineage. But as people got to see apes more commonly, it's interesting to see how they were described and how those early ideas that I talked about, the idea of apes as mischievous, bestial, representing the lowest in humans, get recycled and attached to the apes even as the science begins to develop. So another Dutch writer, Willem Bosman, mentions the West African apes, so these would be chimps and gorillas, in his new and accurate description of the coast of Guinea. I would mention in passing here that the subtitle is, in the English edition, divided into the Gold, the Slave, and the Ivory Coasts. And the question of not just how like humans apes are, but whether Africans are closer to apes than they are to white Europeans is one of the many things that sort of work here when people start to write about them, describe them, and try to make these distinctions. And Bosman in his book, interestingly, says that they are a terrible, pernicious sort of brutes, which seem to be made only for mischief. And some of the Negroes believe as an undoubted truth that these apes can speak, but will not. so that they may not be set to work, which they do not well love. This is their opinion of them. And the retelling of supposed indigenous stories about apes, and then a certain amount of skepticism, again, reinforces a sense of European superiority over the indigenous reporters in this case. And we'll see that as we look to the kind of more immediate context that shapes the Darwin-ape connection. So this is, as it were, some of the early history. Let's turn now to gorillas, who actually play a very important part in this story. And one of the gorilla experts I want to talk about is this man, Richard Owen. Worked at the Royal College of Surgeons, the Hunterian Museum here in London, and then later becomes superintendent of the Natural History departments at the British Museum. And it is largely due to Owen that the British Museum eventually builds a purpose-built museum for natural history, this extraordinary palace, the temple, the modern Museum of Natural History, South Kensington here in London. Until relatively recently, poor old Owen's statue was removed from the grand central nave and Darwin's was put there instead. And in fact, Owen and Darwin, as you may know, were quite strong rivals, and it was quite nice, actually, I think, to see Owen back in his place, given his rightful role, his central role in the creation of this extraordinary, beautiful museum. Let's go back to Owen before he clashes with Darwin. One of the things that's interesting, he comes from quite a humble background, but he becomes an adept politician within the scientific world of his time. And he cultivates a patronage network, particularly among Britain's Anglican establishment, so the most respectable churchmen, politicians, influential people in London. He gets to know them, and he helps them in various ways, and they, of course, become important sources of support when he needs the vast amounts of money that Parliament has to make available to build the Natural History Museum. He's also Britain's leading comparative anatomist and has a particular expertise in apes and monkeys, so very important to this story. But it's interesting, and I think not surprising, given his Anglican patronage network, that he actually uses his expertise to dispute the whole idea of transformism, as evolution is sometimes called at this time. Transformism, or in fact it would sometimes be called transformisme, because it is very much a French idea, associated in particular with this man, Jean-Baptiste Pierre Antoine de Monet de Chevalier de Lamarck, who historians, I think mostly to save time, always refer to simply as Lamarck, who worked at the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris, and is, amongst other things, the man who coins the word biologie originally. And Lamarck publishes this idea over several books, but particularly in this one, the Philosophie zoologique, that species had not all been created at the same time. That in fact, over time, they change, they develop, they become more perfect over time through a process, as I say, that he calls transformism. And this, of course, is a disturbing idea to many people. First of all, the British have a great suspicion of all things French, particularly at this time when the French Revolution is still very recent in people's memories. The Napoleonic Wars are still recent. So anything French is, liberty, equality, fraternity, transformism, coffee you could actually drink. This is all viewed with grave suspicion in England. And I think there's a particular issue, which is that some political radicals pick up on these ideas and use them to argue that perhaps this whole place for everything and everything in its place idea is one of the tricks the ruling class use to keep the workers in their place. And that in fact nature's law is evolution, development, progress, lower things becoming higher things. And that because Lamarck places so much emphasis on the environment as a power that transforms, working class radicals in Britain and elsewhere begin to argue that given proper education, given proper housing, given a decent diet, the working class can evolve to become the ruling class. So you can imagine Owen's posh Anglican patrons are not at all keen on this. And so they're very happy to see their favourite comparative anatomist take up the cudgels or the scalpel against these kinds of ideas. So this is an example from 1855. Owen publishes many papers like this, but the date is significant. This is well before Darwin, right? He concludes his paper by arguing that 90% of the difference which distinguishes the great chimpanzee, as the gorilla was mostly called then, from the human species must stand in contravention to the hypothesis of transmutation and progressive development. Progressive development being, as you recall, the term that the Vestiges used to describe this idea. And of course, the differences between humans and apes and between varieties of human beings, human races as they would have been called at the time, is something that he focuses on as well. So this is an earlier paper, 1853, that the Hottentots, the people that we now call Khoikhoi or Khoisan, the people of southern Africa, and the Papuans of Australia, who were considered in Victorian times to be the most backward, primitive people on the earth, that even those who had the smallest cranial capacity among the human races still had twice as much brain as a gorilla. And so diagrams like this, showing the comparative sizes supposedly of a European, of a Papuan, of a gorilla, and then an orang, indicate a hierarchy which is both a natural hierarchy of human superiority to apes, but obviously also a racial hierarchy as well. And so we're opening up that very dangerous can of worms of the relationship between Darwinism and racism, which is something I'm going to leave for today and come back to in the final lecture. But you can see there are elements of that very clearly in these accounts. In focusing on the brain as perhaps the most important difference between humans and apes, Owen doesn't just talk about size. Size does matter, but he actually gets into the nitty-gritty of the anatomy of the brain. So there are various things that he picks up, but in particular he argues that human brains have unique features, one of which, the hippocampus minor, becomes a particular kind of cause célèbre in arguments about the relationship between humans and apes. And in fact, in his classification, Owen actually creates a taxonomic group, a scientific classificatory group called the Archencephala, the ruling brain, which only contains one species, Homo sapiens. And when he publishes that classification under the pithy title, The Classification and Geographical Distribution of the Mammalia, to which is added an appendix on the gorilla, 1859, kind of a key date in the history here, he concludes that the unique human posture, the hand and the brain together were the means by which man, humans, fulfills his destiny as the master of this earth. From the lowest and of the lowest creation, such are the dominating powers with which we, and we alone, are gifted. And I say gifted, for the surpassing organization was no work of ours. It is he that has made us, not we ourselves. And this is a speech that he gives at Cambridge University, the heart of the Victorian Anglican scientific establishment. And he is saying very much what his patrons want to hear. It has to be said that Owen, on a personal level, was in an awkward position doing this, because he's not the kind of hidebound reactionary that he's sometimes made out to be. The old saying that the history is written by the winners applies quite strongly here, because it was the Darwinians who wrote the history, and they tended to misrepresent Owen when they did. Owen was actually an incredibly advanced scientific thinker, very much in touch with the leading currents in European work, particularly in German transcendental anatomy, as it was known. And it's clear that he was reaching towards some kind of evolutionary theory of his own, almost certainly with some kind of divine direction built into it. But he's no biblical literalist, no clock stopper, not a young earth creationist or anything like that, which is how he's sometimes depicted. And the reason that he got depicted like that is because he clashes very famously with Thomas Henry Huxley, one of the most famous, certainly the most belligerent of Darwin's Victorian supporters. And you can see Huxley here with a drawing of what is very obviously a gorilla's skull. And Huxley sets himself up as an expert on gorillas in direct competition with Owen, with a particular axe to grind, which is to rubbish Owen, but also to attack the whole notion of the Anglican patronage network. He has had to rely himself on Owen's patronage to get his start in life, coming from an even more humble background than Owen did, and he resented it. He wanted to push for scientific careers based only on merit, on the quality of your research. So showing that Owen's research wasn't any good was a good way of saying that the whole patronage network was corrupt. And so he argues very clearly that the hippocampus is a common feature of all primate brains, including apes and ours. There is no sharp difference in the anatomy that allows us to draw the kind of sharp dividing line that Owen wants to draw. And again, just to go back to what I was saying about print culture and the kind of burgeoning mass media that's been created as a result of the industrialization of communications, Huxley uses newly founded kind of young, upstarty, slightly radical magazines like the Natural History Review to push his ideas. Owen stays with more established, more conservative journals, and there's clearly a hope that we're going to keep this whole debate at least within scientific circles, and it's not going to spill out for the unwashed and the kind of red Lamarckians and people like that to get their dirty paws on. It has to be said that may have been his strategy. It failed spectacularly. So this is one of the many places where the debate breaks out from scientific circles into the mass media. This is from Punch, the well-known Victorian scientific journal. And the gorilla here is holding a sign that says, "Am I a man and a brother?" the very famous slogan, of course, of the anti-slavery movement. And there is a touch of Darwin in this. Obviously, 1861 is just a couple of years after the origin. The Darwin-Wedgwood family, very much associated with the anti-slavery cause. And Darwin gets a passing mention here in the poem that accompanies this drawing. But it's one line, because Darwin actually doesn't say very much about gorillas. There's much more detail paid to Owen and Huxley. So this is a verse from the poem, Monkeyana as it's called. "Then Huxley and Owen, with rivalry glowing, with pen and ink rush to the scratch. 'Tis brain versus brain till one of them's slain. By Jove, it'll be a good match." Says Owen, "You can see the brain of chimpanzee is always exceedingly small, with the hindermost horn of extremity shorn, and no hippocampus at all." So, the details of this really quite abstruse and strange technical, anatomical argument are sufficiently well known to actually be brought into Punch and sent up in this way. And I mentioned how earlier texts shape expectations and shape the way that evolutionary debates are going to be read and how Darwin is going to be read. And sure enough, Monkeyana makes an explicit reference to earlier evolutionary ideas. The vestiges taught that all came from naught by development, so-called progressive. So the vestiges is an earlier chapter in the story of which Huxley and Owen, whose debate begins before Darwin, the debate about apes and nature, a very old debate, that becomes another chapter. Darwin becomes another chapter in this longer story, this story of the evolutionary epic. Now, among the differences which the poet emphasizes between apes and humans is the fact that they can't stand upright unless to show fight with Dushayu, that chivalrous knight. Now, who was Dushayu and what has he got to do with this story? It turns out rather a lot. He's actually quite an important part of turning the gorilla into a very popular and well-understood icon that becomes linked to Darwin and to evolutionary ideas. So I want to talk a little bit about him. This is one of many very gripping and exciting illustrations from his books that tell of his adventures in the African jungle. Very much an image of himself as the great white hunter facing down the great apes. Gorillas are very new to science. Almost nobody has seen one. Dushayu claims to be the first white man ever to have hunted one. And so this is a real novelty when he tells these stories. Paul Baloney Dushayu was a French-American. There's a question mark about his dates. There's a question mark about a great many things about Dushayu. And in his own time and since, various people have suggested that he was more a writer of fiction than an accurate scientific reporter. But as I say, that only emerged gradually. He's sent in the mid-1850s by the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia to West Africa to explore what were then really relatively unknown areas. He spends a couple of years there, 3 years, in and around Gabon and areas like that. And as I say, he claims there to have seen gorillas in the wild, to have hunted them, and to have been the first European to have done so. And he publishes this book straight after he gets back, Explorations and Adventures in Equatorial Africa, with gorilla emblazoned all over the title page. Now, I mentioned there's certain doubts about the accuracy of Dushayu's work, and those doubts were prompted almost immediately by the famous frontispiece to his book, supposedly based on eyewitness accounts of gorillas. People noticed an eerie similarity to this picture which appeared in Geoffroy's book, The Gorilla, in the French book, a couple of years earlier. And this was one of a number of points that people picked up on and said, we're not convinced you've actually done all the things you've done. And in fact, other explorers retraced his steps and cast all kinds of doubts over what he'd actually seen. But as I say, that process takes time, and he remains a scientific celebrity for quite a while. One of the things that he emphasizes very strongly in the book is how human-like the gorillas are, how like people they look, and it's actually quite touching to read where he talks about a kind of guilt at having murdered them when he shoots them, and how human they look as they run away in terror from the hunters and so on. It's a more complicated image than perhaps the kind of Great White Hunter picture immediately depicts. But it's particularly this image of the male gorilla, the dominant male, standing up, beating his chest, standing down the hunter, which Punch picks up on, which becomes the kind of the selling point, the great image of the book. Gorillas are ferocious and dangerous, and you need considerable courage to face one in the wild. It's Deschailles in later years, but he comes to London very soon after the book is published, and he comes as the guest of Owen, very much with Owen's patronage and support, and all the gorilla skulls and skeletons which Deschailles collected in Africa become part of Owen's Natural History Museum, and they're still there. And interestingly, the famous picture here of my first gorilla, of Deschailles facing down a gorilla, shooting him at point-blank range in the chest, that actual skin is in the British Museum, and apparently the bullet holes are all in the back. So there are all kinds of doubts about Deschailles' story. Nevertheless, he parlays this fame into an endless series of books. This is a kind of children's version of this. And again, this is a famous story of the gorilla killing the native hunter. The African is not brave enough or strong enough to face down the gorilla, takes his gun and breaks it. So you can see the whole lineage of kind of King Kong and the big scary gorilla of Hollywood and so on have their origins here in this Victorian book. And Deschailles is a very popular figure. This is a much later picture of him lecturing in America to the young people in Boston, but you can see there the picture, you can just see there's the gorilla snapping the gun. That story gets told and retold. And apparently when Deschailles came to London, he lectured with a kind of array of stuffed gorillas behind him, big pictures and so on, kind of audiovisual aids. He really told a good yarn and really gripped the audience and got them very excited. And this gets picked up on in the media of all kinds. Deschailles' gorillas become a sensation over the year or two immediately after Darwin has published. So this is another Punch story about photography, but there you can see that there's that story of the broken gun with the gorilla here lecturing the hunter about being so naughty that it's dangerous to play with firearms and so on. The gorilla is so lionized by literary society, such a popular figure, that he appears here in Punch in evening dress as the lion of the season, being introduced by a rather terrified-looking flunky as he walks in. So the gorilla's human qualities are emphasized, the celebrity is emphasized, and so on. But so are other aspects of the gorilla. This is Punch once again. Agitated tailor to foreign-looking gentleman. You're rather long in the arm, sir, but I'll do my best to fit you. Foreign-looking gentleman, again, is just one of those little subtle hints about the idea that there is a kind of racial hierarchy at work here. And Deschailles tells less than flattering stories about the Africans, their superstitions, their primitive beliefs, their cannibalism, and so on. All the old lies are peddled yet again. And the racial hierarchy becomes explicit in this famous drawing from Punch, which is about Fenianism, Irish nationalism. A recent statement by the Irish is sent up here by reproducing the statement. Underneath it they say, and here is a picture of the author, who is identified as Mr. G. O'Rilla. And the idea that the Irish are an inferior race, not as civilized, not as progressive, not as evolved as the English, is a common trope of English thought in the 19th century, and unfortunately well beyond that. So the ideas of savagery and brutality get attached to the Irish. So you can see very complicated set of stories by which gorillas, Darwin kind of gets attached to the gorilla stories, and then the gorillas have a life of their own that takes Darwinism with it in its wake into all kinds of unexpected places. And one of the unexpected places where Darwin and the gorillas end up is in what I call the consolations of evolution, which I want to talk about by way of bringing this to a close. So this is a famous picture of Huxley and Owen, caricatured here, and they are examining a specimen in spirits, a bottled natural history specimen, which in this case is a water baby. Now, you may well be familiar with this. The Water Babies is a story, a children's story, written by Charles Kingsley here in 1863. And one of the things it does is it rehashes the hippocampus debate and mocks the arguments between Huxley and Owen as it goes along. And so at one point in the book, the narrator says that if water babies really existed, they would have been caught, they would have been put in spirits and cut in half. One half sent to Professor Owen and one to Professor Huxley to see what they would say about it. So the scientific men get drawn into the children's story here. And there's a character in the book called Professor Pitmol in Spirits, who is the learned professor, who is very much a caricature of Huxley, I think. And he had argued that apes, like humans, have hippopotamus majors in their brains, just as men have. The narrator goes on, which was a shocking thing to say. For if it were so, what would become of the faith, hope, and charity of immortal millions? Now, you may think that there are more important differences between you and an ape, such as being able to speak and make machines and know right from wrong and say your prayers. The narrator addresses the child reader and goes on, but that is all a child's fancy, my dear. Nothing is to be depended on but the great hippopotamus test. If you have a hippopotamus major in your brain, you are no ape. Now, you might think that, of course, Kingsley, the author, is the Reverend Charles Kingsley, a devout, if rather radical Christian. And you might think that he is mocking Huxley, mocking the claims of evolution, making a clear distinction between humans and apes. And to some extent he is, but he's more complicated than that. Because The Water Babies is an evolutionary fairy tale. Tom, who's the main character, is a poor chimney sweep, a dirty little pagan, hasn't read the Bible, doesn't know anything about religion. And the book really tells the story of his evolution, and Darwin's ideas and the idea of natural selection are among the many ideas that are brought into this satire. His evolution from this grubby little dirty pagan into a good Christian. And this is an example, I think, of the way that that earlier tradition, the evolutionary epic, the kind of tradition that is there in the vestiges, remains part of the way in which people read Darwin when he comes along. That evolution is a tale of progress, inevitable progress. And for Kingsley, it means progress to ever higher spiritual and moral states. So it's not just about better bodies, better brains, but better morals, better souls. And Kingsley is a really interesting character in Darwin's story. He was quite a well-known naturalist in his own right. He wrote a lovely book called Glaucus, or The Wonders of the Shore, which is a kind of part of the kind of natural historical tradition, sometimes known as natural theology, of examining the wonders of nature as a way of seeing God's handiwork in the natural world. And as I say, he's also a religious writer. He's the Reverend Charles Kingsley and so on. So he's kind of an interesting person, and it's not entirely surprising, given those interests and given his progressive views, that he's on Darwin's mailing list for advanced copies of The Origin. He sends out these to selected people, mostly gentlemen of science, very much in the hope of kind of softening the blow and getting some favourable responses. He really hits pay dirt when he sends this to Kingsley, because Kingsley wrote back thanking Darwin for the book and said that he had gradually learned to see that it is just as noble a conception of deity to believe that he created primal forms capable of self-development into all forms, as to believe that he required a fresh act of intervention to supply the lacunas, the gaps, which he had himself made. So the idea is here that that God is such a great God that he can create living matter imbued, as it were, with foresight, that it can evolve and develop and progress and keep adapting to the changing circumstances of the world. And this is an idea, again, which is echoed very clearly in The Water Babies, where creatures make themselves through evolution. And this idea that there are a natural law of evolution that leads to inevitable progress was sufficiently acceptable to Darwin that he actually got Kingsley's permission to quote those words in the introduction to the second edition of The Origin. And so it's very clear that Darwin is perfectly happy for people to read The Origin the way that Kingsley chose to read it, if they wanted to. And Darwin also makes in the second edition a small change to the book's conclusion. So this is the very famous end to the Origin of Species as it appeared in the first edition. He says here that from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There is a grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms, or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. I love this passage, and there is so much we could say about it, but luckily for you, time is short. I'll just point out, breathed has a definite biblical resonance to it, that the planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity. The evocation of Newton, the greatest English scientist as he was regarded in the 19th century, he, of course, was interpreted in the 19th century as saying that God was like a perfect clockmaker. He had designed the universe so beautifully, wound the mechanism so perfectly, that it just ran forever without any maintenance on the part of its maker. Never needed oiling, never needed winding. And so that notion of a God who can create through law is seen, as Kingsley put it, as a more exalted conception of the divinity than a God who has to step in and kind of hand design every new species of slug when one has gone extinct and so on. So there are all those kinds of evocations of law and nature and so on, but I think the tense of the final sentence is particularly interesting. Beautiful, wonderful, exalted, all this kind of biblical, rather religious language, but it ends, have been and are being evolved. The idea that evolution is not over. Evolution is continuing forward, and that perhaps better things are still to come. Now, I mentioned that Darwin made a small change to this conclusion in the second edition only a few months after the first. He's added 3 words here. You can see this a little bit longer. 3 words. By the Creator. Originally breathed by the Creator. So that theistic reading of evolution, that idea that evolution is perhaps designed and managed by God, intended by God, is made more plausible by Darwin in later editions. Now, it's a complicated picture because elsewhere in the book he takes out references to the Creator and regrets having used that kind of language in places, but he adds it here. The book goes through 5 more editions in his lifetime, and he leaves it there for those 5 editions. Now, I am personally not very interested in what Darwin really believed or what he really thought. I don't think historically that's the most interesting question to ask. The more interesting question is to think about how people read Darwin. And I mentioned in the last lecture that some people could find evolution consoling. This is a famous passage with which Darwin ends the chapter on the struggle for existence. When we reflect on this struggle, we may console ourselves. Again, a phrase with biblical resonance. I said the Judeo-Christian Bible is one of the books that shaped the way people read the origin. Console, the consolations of religion, that idea would have been there. We may console ourselves with the full belief that the war of nature is not incessant, that no fear is felt, that death is generally prompt, and that the vigorous, the healthy, and the happy survive and multiply. Now, that is, of course, a very different consolation to conventional Christianity. There's no 2 ways about it. This is a kind of statistical consolation that, on average, the good, the healthy, the happy survive and multiply. Things work out for the best, generally speaking. It doesn't give you a sense of individual purpose or meaning, an explanation for what has just happened in your life. But perhaps that's part of the strength. I also mentioned in the last lecture that the Darwins, Emma and Charles, lost 3 of their children in infancy, and infant mortality is frighteningly high in Victorian times, higher, much, much higher than it is now, 25 times higher. And there is some evidence to suggest it might actually have been rising, possibly because of urbanization and the spread of contagious diseases, poor sanitation, things like that. But even wealthy people like the Darwins, with the best medical care money could buy, lose 3 children in infancy. Now, if you think about traditional, conventional Christianity, the idea that God is imminent, present in the world, he oversees and directs everything, that not a sparrow falls without him willing it. This is hard stuff to handle from that perspective. God has personally stepped in and killed your child. Why? Theologically, it's a very complex issue, one I'm not qualified to judge, and we certainly don't have time for. But many Victorians found it difficult to accept conventional Christianity. And so this more diffuse picture of progress that generally works out for the best in the long run is one form of consolation for some people. So the fact that the evolution of humans from apes means that there's nothing distinctive or special, no immortal soul, no its distinct act of creation that made us, undermines traditional Christianity, but as I say, for some people, that's actually perhaps a good thing. And that have been and are being evolved, I always come back to that as thinking about the notion of a better future to come. And it's something that clearly struck people straight away. So one of the very first reviews of the origin appeared in the Athenaeum, very prestigious, posh literary journal at the time, just a few days after the book itself. And I'll leave you with this quote from that review. The reviewer commented that an unbroken, sure though slow, living progress towards animal perfection is a delightful vision. Natural and gradual optimism is a welcome fancy. What need of distinct creation? This is perhaps a little tongue-in-cheek, but it is one way in which you could choose to read the origin, a slow, gradual movement up towards perfection. And with the tense of Darwin's conclusion in mind, the reviewer continued, if a monkey has become a man, what may not a man become? Thank you very much for listening.